It's Friday, everyone. What do we do on Fridays here at the Hint Hive? That's right, we smash the patriarchy. Hello, ladies of the Hive. Welcome back to the Hint Hive, Amplifying Women's Voices, the podcast where we talk about women, psychology, feminism, empowerment, and all the messy, fascinating, infuriating, and sometimes downright ridiculous things that come with being a woman in this world. I'm your host, Kelly Hint, psychotherapist, feminist life coach, and your resident queen bee of this hive. Today, we are talking about something that can be incredibly frustrating if you care about gender equality. And if you're watching this, yes, I'm aware that the sun is beaming me right in the eyeballs right now. So let's try to get through this together. So sometimes it seems like every time women make progress, boom, here comes the backlash. Women demand equal pay, there's resistance. Women enter professions traditionally dominated by men, there's resistance. Women gain more political power, resistance. Women becoming financially independent, resistance. Women becoming more sexually autonomous, resistance. Women decide that they don't want children, resistance. Women decide they do want children but don't want motherhood to consume their entire identity, also resistance. Women speak openly about abuse, harassment, discrimination, reproductive health care, menopause, mental health, or sexuality. Apparently, everybody suddenly has an opinion. And sometimes, the backlash is not subtle. Sometimes it is legislation. Sometimes it's workplace discrimination. Sometimes it's harassment. Sometimes it's social media attacks. I've had lots of those myself. Sometimes it's the classic, women have it better than men now. Or, what more do you want? Or my personal favorite, nobody is stopping you. Well, sometimes people actually are. And sometimes the resistance isn't even conscious. That's what we're going to explore today. Because if we want to understand why gender equality remains such a complicated battle, we have to understand something uncomfortable. Progress doesn't just change women's lives. It changes power relationships. And whenever power shifts, somebody's going to feel like they're losing something. So today, we're getting into the backlash against women's progress, why it happens, and what it means. So let's get into it. So what exactly is backlash? Let's start with the concept itself. In feminist scholarship, the term backlash is often used to describe organized, cultural, political, or interpersonal resistance that emerges in response to advances in women's rights or social status. One of the most influential discussions of this idea came from journalist and author Susan Faludi, whose 1991 book, Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, argued that periods of women's advancement were frequently followed by cultural campaigns, suggesting that feminism itself was responsible for women's problems. And that idea is important, because backlash isn't necessarily a sign that progress isn't happening. Sometimes, backlash is evidence that progress is happening. Think about that. If nobody's power, expectations, privileges, or assumptions were being challenged, there wouldn't be much to resist. Backlash can be a reaction to change. And change is uncomfortable, especially when people have benefited from the status quo. So why does this happen? Let's talk psychology. Human beings generally like predictability. We develop expectations about how the world works. We learn social roles. We learn what's considered normal. We learn what men are supposed to do. We learn what women are supposed to do. And those expectations become deeply ingrained. Psychologists sometimes refer to these kinds of expectations as social norms or gender role beliefs. The problem is that when a social norm changes, people experience something called cognitive dissonance. That's the psychological discomfort that occurs when our beliefs, behaviors, or expectations don't quite fit neatly together. Imagine someone has spent their entire life believing men are natural leaders. Then they encounter a highly competent woman leading a company. That creates a challenge to their existing belief. They have options. They can update their belief and think maybe leadership ability isn't inherently male. Or they can protect their existing belief. And protecting the existing belief might sound like, she's too aggressive. She's difficult. She got promoted because she's a woman. She probably slept with someone. She's not really leadership material. Notice what happened. Instead of changing the belief, they changed the interpretation of the woman. That is psychologically easier. Now let's talk about when confidence becomes aggression. This is one of my favorite examples of how gender expectations operate. Research has repeatedly found that women and men can be evaluated differently for similar behaviors. A man who is assertive may be perceived as confident. A woman who is assertive may be perceived as abrasive. A man who negotiates may be seen as ambitious. A woman who negotiates may be seen as demanding. A man who expresses anger may be perceived as passionate or authoritative. A woman expressing the same anger can be labeled emotional or unstable. Now, obviously, these are not universal reactions, but gender stereotypes can influence how identical behaviors are interpreted. And here's the frustrating part. Sometimes women are punished for behaving in stereotypically masculine ways, while also being punished for behaving in stereotypical feminine ways. Be too soft, you're weak. Be too assertive, you're intimidating. Be accommodating, people take advantage of you. Set boundaries, you are selfish. Be ambitious, you are neglecting your family. Prioritize your family, you're not serious about your career. And then women wonder, why am I exhausted all of the time? Because we are sometimes trying to navigate a maze where the rules change depending on which direction we walk. And backlash is not always obvious. Here's something important. Backlash doesn't always look like someone standing in the street screaming, "I hate women's rights." In fact, some of the most effective resistance can sound incredibly reasonable. I'm all for equality, but women already have equal opportunities. This isn't really a women's issue. Why does everything have to be about feminism? Maybe women should just work harder. We're focusing too much on gender. Men have problems too. And here's the thing. Yes, men absolutely have problems. Patriarchy harms men too. Rigid masculinity can discourage emotional vulnerability, help-seeking, caregiving, and healthy relationships. But acknowledging men's struggles does not erase women's struggles. These conversations can coexist. We don't have to turn equality into a competition over who is suffering more. The goal is to dismantle systems and expectations that limit human beings based on gender. That, my friends, is good for everybody. Now let's talk about something particularly interesting psychologically. Status threat. When people perceive their social status or access to power is being reduced, they may perceive another group's gains as their own loss. And this is where the idea of a zero-sum mindset comes in. A zero-sum belief assumes that if women gain power, men must lose power. If women gain opportunities, men must lose those opportunities. If women gain representation, men must lose representation. But society isn't necessarily a fixed pie. Increasing women's access to education, employment, political participation, healthcare, entrepreneurship, and leadership does not inherently require taking rights away from men. In many circumstances, expanding opportunities creates more opportunity. But if someone has learned to understand status as hierarchical, someone has to be on top, then equality can feel threatening. Because equality isn't necessarily experienced as everybody wins. It can be experienced as, I'm losing my special position. And that is a very different psychological experience. And the loss of privilege can feel like oppression to some. Here's another uncomfortable concept. When someone is accustomed to receiving an advantage, removing that advantage can feel like punishment. That's one reason discussions about privilege can become so emotionally charged. If a person has never had to think about gender affecting their opportunities, they may experience equality efforts as unfair treatment when the system starts correcting an imbalance. Imagine a workplace where men have historically been promoted more often. Now the organization starts intentionally examining hiring, promotion, pay, and leadership practices. Someone says, "Why are they suddenly giving women special treatment?" But there's another way to interpret what's happening. We are finally examining whether the old system was actually neutral. Those are two very different narratives. And here's where women themselves can become part of the backlash. There is the social enforcement of women. And before anyone gets defensive, hear me out. Patriarchal systems don't survive solely because men enforce them. Social norms are often enforced by everyone. Women can police other women's behavior. Think about the comments. We've all read them online or experienced them in our workplace. She's too full of herself. She thinks she's better than everyone. She's a terrible mother. She should dress her age. She's asking for attention. She's sleeping her way to the top. She's too masculine. She's too sexual. She's not feminine enough. She needs to settle down. She's too career-focused. She is wasting her life. These messages teach women what happens when they step outside the boundaries. And sometimes women internalize those expectations so deeply that they enforce them on themselves. That, ladies, is internalized sexism. I've been there and battled with some of that myself. And it's one of the reasons feminist consciousness can be so powerful. Because sometimes the person telling you, don't take up too much space, isn't standing outside of you. It's living in your head. Women are frequently navigating what social scientists call a double bind. A double bind happens when you're caught between two conflicting expectations where satisfying one creates punishment from the other. For example, be warm but not overly emotional. Be confident, but not intimidating. Be attractive, but not too sexual. Be successful, but don't make your partner feel threatened. Be independent, but don't become unapproachable. Be a mother, but don't let motherhood interfere with your work. Work hard, but don't appear obsessed with your career. Speak up, but don't be difficult. It's exhausting. And it creates something I want every woman listening to understand. Sometimes the problem is not that you're failing to find the right balance. sometimes the expectations themselves are contradictory. So why does backlash get louder during periods of change? There's another fascinating pattern. Backlash can intensify when marginalized groups make visible gains. Why? Because social change becomes harder to ignore. When only a handful of women enter a traditionally male profession, people can treat them as exceptions. But when women become a substantial presence, now the institution itself has changed. When one woman becomes CEO, that's an individual story. When women increasingly occupy leadership positions across an industry, that is structural change. And structural change challenges deeply embedded assumptions. This is one reason progress can feel like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Social change is not linear. It is messy. There can be advancement, resistance, retrenchment, renewed activism, and advancement again. That does not mean that progress is meaningless. It means social systems are complicated. And we can't talk about backlash against women's progress without talking about politics. Women's rights have always been political. Voting rights, property rights, employment discrimination, reproductive rights, access to education, sexual harassment protections, domestic violence laws, marriage laws, divorce laws, equal opportunity, political representation. These aren't simply cultural conversations. They involve institutions, laws, policies, courts, workplaces, schools, and governments. And when political power changes, the legal environment can change too. That's why feminism can not only be about individual confidence. Confidence matters, boundaries matter, self-esteem matters, but if a woman is confident while an institution systematically discriminates against her, telling her to believe in herself is simply not enough. Sometimes the system needs to change. That's an important distinction between individual empowerment and structural change. We need both. And progress does not mean that the work is finished. Here's another trap. People sometimes look at progress and conclude, well, women can vote, women can work, women can own property, women can go to college. What else do you want? But progress in one area does not automatically erase inequality everywhere. And formal equality doesn't always produce identical outcomes. For example, a law can say men and women are equally entitled to this opportunity. But cultural expectations, caregiving responsibilities, discrimination, economic barriers, harassment, socialization, and workplace practices can still influence who actually benefits from that opportunity. Legal equality and lived equality are not always the same thing. And that's why feminism keeps evolving. Let's talk about the backlash cycle. Here's a framework that I want you to remember. Think of social change as a cycle. Step 1, women challenge an existing limitation. Step 2, women gain visibility or power. Step 3, the status quo feels threatened. Step 4, resistance emerges. Step 5, the resistance creates conflict and debate. And then step 6, society renegotiates the norm. And eventually, something that once seemed radical can become completely ordinary. Think about women in professions, women voting, women managing their own finances, women owning businesses, women pursuing higher education, women choosing whether or not to marry. Many things that were once considered outrageous are now actually routine. That doesn't mean that the backlash wasn't real. It means that the backlash didn't necessarily win. So what does this all mean for you? What does backlash mean for women today? It means that if you are experiencing resistance because you're changing your life, resistance doesn't automatically mean that you are doing something wrong. Listen to that again. Resistance does not automatically mean that you are doing something wrong. Maybe you're setting boundaries. Maybe you're asking for a raise. Maybe you're leaving an unhealthy relationship. Maybe you're pursuing a career that people just don't understand. Maybe you're starting a business. Maybe you're choosing not to have children. Maybe you're choosing to have children differently. Maybe you're speaking publicly. Maybe you're becoming politically active. Maybe you are refusing to tolerate sexist behavior. Maybe you're simply saying no and somebody doesn't like it. Their discomfort is not automatically evidence that your boundary is unreasonable. But here's the caveat. Now, because I am the resident psychotherapist and not your personal hype woman 24/7, although I am absolutely your personal hype woman a lot of the time, we need to make one distinction. Not every criticism is misogyny. Not every disagreement is backlash. Not every person who challenges you is trying to suppress you. Sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes we screw up. Sometimes our communication sucks. Sometimes somebody gives us useful feedback. And feminism does not require us to become incapable of self-reflection. In fact, healthy empowerment requires the ability to say, okay, maybe I need to rethink that. The goal is not to become so defensive that nobody can ever challenge you. The goal is to become grounded enough to determine, is this feedback useful, or is it an attempt to control me? That, my friends, is emotional intelligence. That is discernment, and that is badass. Now, let's talk about how to respond to backlash. Let's get practical because understanding backlash is interesting, but knowing what to do about it is better. So I've got 10 action steps for us to talk about. Step number 1, identify the source. When you encounter resistance, ask what exactly is being threatened. Is someone upset because you violated a social expectation? Because your success changes a relationship dynamic? Because you established a boundary? Because you're challenging someone's belief? Because you actually behaved inappropriately? Get specific. Don't automatically internalize criticism. Analyze it. Step number 2, separate discomfort from danger. This is huge. Someone being uncomfortable with your choices does not automatically mean that you are unsafe. Sometimes we are socialized to manage everybody else's emotional reactions. So when somebody gets angry, disappointed, or annoyed, we immediately think, I need to fix this. No. Sometimes you need to assess the situation. If you are physically unsafe, financially vulnerable, or dealing with an abusive person, safety comes first. But if someone is simply annoyed because you said no, they can survive disappointment. You do not have to regulate every adult's emotions. Step number 3, stop over-explaining. I've talked about this before, and I'm going to talk about it again. Women are often socialized to justify themselves. We say, I'm sorry, I can't because. Then we give a 14-minute TED Talk about why we can't attend dinner. You don't always need an explanation. Try, that doesn't work for me. Or, I've decided not to do that. Or, no thank you. or that's not something I'm willing to participate in. Period. Full stop. No dissertation required. Step number 4, find your hive. You need people who understand what you're doing. Not necessarily people who agree with everything you say, but people who don't require you to shrink in order to belong. Build relationships with women who celebrate ambition, people who respect boundaries, friends who tell you the truth without tearing you down, mentors who want you to succeed, communities where your voice is not treated like an inconvenience. We are social creatures. Connection matters. You don't have to fight every battle alone. Step number 5, expect some resistance. This one can change your entire mindset. If you assume once I become confident, everyone will support me, you are going to be very disappointed. Confidence does not eliminate resistance. Sometimes confidence allows you to tolerate resistance without abandoning yourself. That is a completely different goal. The question isn't, how do I make everyone like my choices? The question is, can I make choices aligned with my values even when someone doesn't approve? That is empowerment. Step number 6, don't internalize the label. When women break expectations, they often receive labels. Bossy, difficult, aggressive, selfish, cold, intimidating, emotional, too much, too ambitious, too sexual, too political, too independent. And sometimes we start asking, what if they are right? Instead, ask, what behavior is actually being criticized? If someone says you're difficult, what specifically did you do? If you are labeled aggressive, what did you say? If you are selfish, what boundary did you set? Make the criticism concrete, because vague labels are incredibly powerful tools of social control. Step number 7, pick your battles. And yes, the queen bee is saying this. You do not have to respond to everything. Not every sexist comment deserves your energy. Not every internet troll deserves a debate. Not every family dinner deserves a 3-hour feminist lecture over Thanksgiving dinner. Sometimes the most powerful response is interesting, and then you go live your life. Ladies, your energy is a resource. Spend it intentionally. All right, step number 8, document structural problems. If you're dealing with discrimination at work, harassment, unequal treatment, retaliation, or any other serious institutional issue, don't rely solely on emotional processing. Document. Save emails. Write down dates. Record what happened. Learn your workplace policies. Seek qualified legal or professional guidance when appropriate. And remember, you do not have to solve a structural problem with personal resilience alone. Sometimes you need systems, policies, advocacy, and collective action. Step number 9, let yourself be visible. This is one of the most radical things that a woman can do. Be visible. Take the microphone. Put your name on the project. Apply for the position. Ask for the money. Publish the book. Start the business. Run for office. Create the art. Take up space. Speak. And when that little voice in your head says, "Who do you think you are?" answer it. Someone who belongs here. And finally, action step number 10. Remember that you are part of the change. Here's something I really, really want you to remember. You do not have to personally dismantle the patriarchy before lunch. You don't have to fix every institution. You do not have to educate every person. You do not have to become an activist full time. But every time you refuse to teach another generation of girls that they have to shrink to be lovable, every time that you teach a daughter, a niece, student, friend, or younger woman that her voice matters, every time you challenge an unfair assumption, every time you support another woman, every time you refuse to participate in tearing down another woman, you are changing the culture. Small acts can have enormous ripple effects. All right, let's zoom out for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. Backlash can be frightening. It can also be revealing, because backlash tells us where the pressure points are. It tells us what is changing. It tells us which norms are being challenged. And it reminds us that equality isn't simply about giving women permission to enter spaces. It is about transforming the spaces themselves. We don't want women to succeed by becoming adaptable versions of men. We want women to have the freedom to define success for themselves. And we want men to have that freedom too. That is the feminist vision. Not women becoming powerful enough to dominate everyone else, but gender no longer determining who gets to speak, lead, earn, love, parent, create, explore, or live freely. That is the goal. All right, Hive, you know what time it is. It is time for our badass affirmation of the week. And this week's affirmation is, I will not shrink myself to protect someone else's comfort. I can stand in my truth, take up space, and keep moving forward, even when my growth challenges old expectations. I love this one, because here's the thing. Your growth may make some people uncomfortable. Your boundaries may make some people uncomfortable. Your ambition may make some people uncomfortable. Your independence may make some people uncomfortable. Your voice may make some people uncomfortable. And you know what? Their discomfort is not automatically your responsibility. That doesn't mean we become cruel. It doesn't mean we stop listening. It doesn't mean we stop learning. It means we stop confusing somebody else's discomfort with evidence that we should disappear. Sometimes your growth will expose somebody else's outdated expectations. Sometimes your confidence will challenge someone's assumptions. Sometimes your freedom will make someone realize they don't have the control over you that they once had. And guess what? That's okay. You are allowed to grow. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to become louder. You are allowed to become softer. You are allowed to become more ambitious. You are allowed to become less accommodating. You are allowed to take up space. And you are allowed to become the woman you actually want to be. So say it with me. I will not shrink myself to protect someone else's comfort. Again, I will not shrink myself to protect someone else's comfort. And one more time for the women in the back. I will not shrink myself to protect someone else's comfort. That, ladies, is your affirmation. Carry it with you this week. Put it on your phone. Put it on a sticky note. Say it before the difficult conversation. Say it before the job interview. Say it before you hit publish. Say it when somebody tells you you're too much. Because maybe you're not too much. Maybe someone else simply got very comfortable with you being less. Hive, here's what I want you to take away from today's conversation. Women's progress has never been a perfectly straight line. There have been advances. There have been setbacks. There have been movements forward and periods of resistance, and there will probably continue to be. But resistance does not mean that we stop. It means we understand what we are dealing with. We stop assuming that every obstacle is a personal failure. We stop telling women that if they just become confident enough, positive enough, pretty enough, agreeable enough, or resilient enough, everything will magically work out. Sometimes the problem is not the woman. Sometimes the system is broken. Sometimes the expectation is the problem. Sometimes the double standard is the problem. Sometimes the culture needs to change. And yes, individual empowerment matters, but collective change matters too. So don't just ask, how can I become stronger? Ask what needs to change so women don't have to be extraordinarily strong just to receive ordinary respect. That is a very different question. And that is where feminism becomes bigger than individual self-improvement. Because we aren't simply trying to teach women how to survive unfair systems. We are working toward a world where those systems become less unfair. So when you encounter backlash, don't automatically think, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Sometimes ask, what does my progress reveal? What expectation am I challenging? What outdated rule am I refusing to follow? What assumption am I disrupting? What door am I opening? And perhaps, most importantly, who might walk through that door after me? Because that's how progress works. One woman pushes the door open, another walks through, another holds it open, and another widens the doorway. And eventually, what once seemed impossible becomes ordinary. That is the hive. We don't just survive the backlash. We learn from it. We recognize it. We refuse to let it define us. And we keep moving. Okay, Hive, here's your challenge this week. I want you to identify one place in your life where you've been shrinking yourself to avoid someone else's discomfort. Maybe you're holding back an opinion. Maybe you're afraid to ask for more money. Maybe you're avoiding a boundary. Maybe you're making yourself smaller in a relationship. Maybe you're not pursuing something because you're worried about what people will think. Identify it. And then ask yourself, what would I do differently if I didn't believe their discomfort was my responsibility? You don't have to blow up your entire life tomorrow. Just take one step, one conversation, one boundary, one application, one request, one no, one moment of taking up space. And of course, if this episode resonated with you, share it with another woman who needs the reminder that resistance doesn't mean she's wrong. Share it on social media. Send it to your best friend. Drop a comment. Come on over to the Hint Hive podcast group and tell me where you are refusing to shrink yourself. And if you're enjoying the Hint Hive, please follow or subscribe where you're listening, leave a review, and help us grow this community. Because the bigger the hive gets, the louder women's voices become. And that is exactly what we are here to do. Until next time, my queens, remember, your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. Your ambition matters. Your freedom matters. And you don't have to make yourself smaller to make the world more comfortable. Now go out there and take up some damn space. I'll see you next time here in the Hive. This podcast is powered by Kelly Hint Empowerment Coaching, as well as Kelly M. Hint LMHC and The Cranky Counselor. To find out more about coaching services, head over to CoachKellyHint.com. If you'd like to know more about the psychotherapy services I offer to individuals within the state of New York, you can check out kellymhint.com. And if you'd like to learn more about aromatherapy, you can check out thecrankycounselor.com.